In 1889, Copper King W.A. Clark and 74 other men wrote a state constitution to serve the needs of Montana's powerful interests, with a weak governor, a secretive legislature, and special tax deals for the powerful. After 60 years under the copper collar, Montana was declared the nearest thing to a colony of any American state. The Anaconda Mining Company even owned most Montana newspapers, the Copper Press. The corporate dominance of Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. 70 years after statehood, the Copper Press was finally sold, and thousands of World War II veterans had been educated under the GI Bill. Newly enlightened Montanans wanted out from under the copper collar, and big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Changing Montana's constitution was the top priority. Strengthening the governorship, opening up the legislature, empowering citizens. Voices of Montana women, totally silenced in 1889, rang out loud and clear for these changes. When the Constitutional Convention began, 19 women were among the elected delegates. And when the delegates came together in convention, Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, men and women, young and old, sat alphabetically as equals, Montanans just wanting to make their state better. And so they did, producing a constitution for the ages, the last best constitution. Now, at its 50th anniversary, Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time shine a light on the creation of this remarkable Montana Constitution.
Welcome back to Last Best Constitution, our series that we've all put together here on the 50th anniversary of Montana's 1972 Constitution. This Montana History Series is designed to tell the story of the times that we're working in at the time of the 1970s and the era of change that was taking place in Montana and nationally, and the things that led up to the need for this Constitution, which is widely recognized as not just likely the best state constitution in the nation, but also widely recognized as perhaps one of the predominant constitutions in the world in terms of what you look for in terms of what ought to be in a constitution. And we ought to be rightly proud of it. In fact, Montanans are. And so on this 50th anniversary, we're trying to recreate some of the times and using the actual people who are participating. We have in our series almost all the living remaining delegates to the Constitutional Convention, the key research staffers that did a lot of the legwork for them and digging out information in those days when we didn't have an internet and research was a tough game. And we're dealing with key staff people and people such as today who they or their organizations participated in the processes of the Constitution in different ways. You know, the Constitution, we do have, the seeds of that Constitution came out of our previous Constitution, which Montana had lived with for 83 years before the new one was created. And there were things in that old Constitution that made it necessary for there to be change. And we're going to talk about that all today with two really special guests. We're really happy to have them around the table here with us. First is Chuck Johnson and then Nancy Leifer. Briefly, Nancy is the president of the Montana, or the League of Women Voters of Montana. I have to get that title just right. And nobody played a bigger role in getting the Constitutional Convention called and the things happening than that organization, the League of Women Voters. So we're going to talk about that. And then Chuck Johnson. Chuck has been, by the way, I know both of these people. Worked with Nancy on the 50th celebration. That's when we first became acquainted, and she was on the executive committee of the Constitutional Convention Celebration Committee. And we've had a wonderful relationship, and I'm so happy you're here. And Chuck and I have known each other for most of those 50 years. When I was a young executive director of the Democratic Party, he was a fledgling reporter that covered the Constitutional Convention in 1971. I always like to call him the Dean of the Capitol Press Corps because he's worked for so many years and knows anything and everything about what goes on in Montana government and politics. And Chuck, we've done a lot of other things together, but I'm so happy you're joining us on this event. Now, I mentioned you being with the Capitol Reporters, but tell us how you got assigned to the convention, and then a little bit more about your pedigree from that point, or even your family life.
Okay, well, I was working for the Associated Press as a vacation replacement reporter in 1971, and the bureau chief was a guy named Paul Freeman.
Yeah.
And at the end of the summer, he asked if I'd like to cover the convention. And I was like, oh my gosh. He picked me over the veteran AP reporter J.D. Holmes. And
Right.
that was kind of a shock to me. And I said, well, what about J.D.? And he said, J.D.'s okay with it. And I talked to J.D. and he said, go ahead and do it. So I did it. I don't think I would have if J.D. hadn't said okay.
Yeah, well, J.D. was definitely at that time the dean, wasn't he? In fact, the press corps room right now up at the Capitol has got his name on it, right?
That's right.
And by the way, I taught his son in junior high school.
Okay.
So we know you say about Montana, we're a small town with really long streets. We're all connected, right? So you were asked to do that. Were you fresh out of J school or what?
I'd finished journalism school in 1970, and I was working on a master's in history, but I kept getting interrupted by opportunities like this, so I didn't get the master's degree till 78 because I get interns and jobs and stuff like that. But this was a great choice not to go back to school and to cover the convention.
And then tell us what you did following the convention a little bit so that people get a sense of your seasoning, if you will.
I worked a couple years at the Missoulian. I was special projects and politics reporter there, and then I came to Helena for the Lee newspaper's state bureau, covering the Capitol and politics. Then I went to the Great Falls Tribune Capitol Bureau and did the same, and then back to Lee.
Now, you were with the Tribs Bureau for the
15
longest
years.
time, 15
Yeah.
years, right? Yeah.
And
Back to the Lee.
back to Lee, and then I ended up covering one session for the Bozeman Chronicle in 2017. But
In your semi-retirement at
Yeah.
that point, yeah. You couldn't resist one more session.
One more
right?
time.
One more time, yeah. Well, that's terrific. And then, Nancy, the League of Women Voters was so critical to this thing. And tell us about first when you took over the league, because you're the heir of a great bit of history here. Tell us about that and a little bit about your previous experiences too. And
Sure. So I actually didn't get involved with the league till after I retired.
Mm-hmm.
But it's one of those everything you've done in your entire life has prepared you for this moment kind of deals. Because I have a bachelor's degree in sociology from the University of Montana. I came out here in '71, just as this was all coming together to go to school. And then I went on and did a master's at what used to be the Woodrow Wilson School at the Princeton University in public administration, and came back to Montana just in time to be part of that new wave of things happening in the early 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
And then worked with a number of different organizations in between times, but I've also been in state government twice. I was with the Department of Commerce when it first got formed, just after the 1980-81 period when it was created, and then again from 2005 to about 2010 working with the Montana Board of Housing.
Which was in commerce.
In commerce also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have a lot of governmental experience.
A lot of governmental experience,
And,
yep.
You knew a little bit about what the legislature did.
Yes.
And they had to deal with that and everything. Because that's such an important part of what we have, the changes in the Constitution and the demand for the change. A lot came out of that. When we look at the history of the Montana Constitution, it's at least interesting and worth noting that when Montana first became a territory, right, during the Civil War, our territorial governor, who now rides a horse in front of the Capitol with his sword held high, Thomas Francis Meagher, was a rather audacious expat Irishman who came to the United States and formed a militia in New York City that he offered to the Union government during the Civil War, and he said, "I'll fight some battles for you." And he was very successful, and so they rewarded him by making him the first territorial governor of Montana. And again, very audacious fella. He got out here and decided, you know what we need? We need a constitution. Now, you don't really need a constitution unless you're going to be a state. And but he presumed that now that he was out here, statehood was coming very fast. And so he authorized a constitution. And they wrote up a constitution, and they decided they were going to send it back to Congress as his first step to becoming a state. And so the 1884 Constitution had 45 delegates here. The 1866 Constitution, 55 delegates in Helena. And so and transportation was not easy in those days. So they took the Constitution and they headed down the Missouri River with it to get it back to D.C. And down the Missouri they went with it, and they stopped off in St. Louis. And then suddenly, it sounds like maybe after a rowdy night out, somehow the Constitution disappeared and was never seen again. So it never got to D.C., and not that it would have gotten much traction anyway. But actually then, 18 years later, excuse me, in 1884, there was a whole group of states wanting to get in, territories wanting to become states, and Montana was one of them. So they went ahead and put a constitution together in anticipation of becoming a state. And the person that was chairman of that constitutional convention was one W.A. Clark, who is often known as the most nefarious of the Copper Kings out of Butte. And Clark chaired that convention. There were 45 delegates, and they took that and they wrote it up. And I would make the point that all men, women didn't have the right to vote, and they wouldn't likely be put into a constitutional forum of any kind. So a bunch of men got together, and they were frankly represented the powerful interests of the times. And they wrote a constitution which went off to D.C., but lo and behold, Congress was reticent, and we remained a territory. So they put that in the back drawer and waited a while. And in 1889, there was a whole series of states went in, about 4 or 5 at the same time. And when they went in, we had to have a constitution, so they went and dug that out of the drawer and started with what they had before and kept. And Clark, guess what? Clark, again, a Copper King, 5 years richer, 5 years more powerful, gathered with a bunch of, with in that case, 75 delegates in 1889. And they were all men again, and they put together a constitution. And as I mentioned in the introduction, the seeds of the 1972 Constitution came out of the 1889 Constitution, because with all the powerful vested interests of the time sitting around, and in those days, those were the copper industry out of Butte and the industrialized side of the state, with the railroads that served it, and with the timber interests that served it, and with the coal mines that served it, and the large ranchers, the stock growers, if you will, of eastern Montana. Farmers weren't nearly as organized and as powerful as the ranchers were. And so those were the entities that formulated that constitutional convention, and they wrote an interesting constitution that kind of, as you might expect, served the interests of the powerful. Isn't that how you recall it?
Yeah, that's right, Evan. And it was also known for creating a very weak state government, a weak executive branch, a very weak legislative branch, and a weak judiciary. So things were in the hands of the industrialists, and that's how they liked it. And it was maybe good for the times, but it certainly wasn't good for the long time, because it left out a lot of things, and it really tilted the scales.
Well, if you think about it, if your government often helps those that really need help. That's one of the premises of government. We can help you. The powerful don't need help. So a strong government, which might be needed to help little people, kind of got in the way of the powerful interests who could take care of themselves economically, and so they created a weak constitution. The governor was extraordinarily weak. They had these boards that would head departments, such departments as they had. They have these boards, and there were 7 people on the board, and one appointed every year. So a governor would get in, and by the time he appointed his 4th board member, his first term was already over with. And so he really didn't run the government, and it went like that for a long ways. And
the boards hired what were called executive secretaries, the directors. So they answered to the boards, not the governors.
Yeah. It was very unresponsive to the needs of the people, but the vested interests got along just fine because they were powerful, and they got their way pretty much anyway. Now the legislative weakness. Did you? The league recognized that substantially.
Substantially, yeah. We had some citizen lobbyists, who went to the legislature in the late 60s and observed how difficult it was as a citizen to find out what was going on. There was the committee meetings and things were posted not very much, with very much notice ahead of time, and all of the major decisions were made in executive session, and the executive sessions were closed. Nobody could be there when those final arguments were made and the actual sausage got made in the executive sessions, and nobody was there allowed to go in and see how that happened. So, yeah, the league started doing some studies in the late 60s of what should be in a constitution, and was one of the major organizations that started pushing for reform.
Yeah, and I say recognizing that the product of the first Constitution was this legislature that was secretive.
Yes.
For sure. The decisions made in private. Executive session truly meant, all right, all of you citizens, leave the room. We'll take care of this. But also a lack of many recorded votes.
Yes.
Very interesting. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but those things were baked into the Constitution. Also preferences, some real kind of preferences. I know people find this hard to believe, but the Constitution of 1889 said that, think of all the money that was made in Montana. The preponderance of it was out of Butte and Anaconda with copper, and all that fed that machinery. I mean, you realize at one point in time, the Anaconda Company had 3/4 of the paychecks in Montana were signed by the Anaconda Company, and so they were very, very powerful. And but in the Constitution, Clark and his friends made sure that it said that the proceeds of mining could not be taxed. Now think about that. Proceeds of mining could not be taxed, and so. That was pretty egregious, and it was one of the things that was, by the time we got to the 70s, people were really upset about by that time. There were special interest things for the stock industry too. When you tax cattle, the local assessor, in those days, the weak state government meant that taxes, the county assessor did it all. If you knew the county assessor, you get a special deal on your house or your ranch or whatever, but beyond that, the assessor had to go out and say, well, how many cattle do you have here? We're going to tax these cattle. And if you had a big ranch, when the county assessor from Carbon County went out to look for the cattle were over in Stillwater County, across the county line. And then when the Stillwater County assessor went out, magically the cattle were on the Carbon County side, and they avoided taxes. So those were the kind of special things that really, looking back on them, look so egregious, and yet they were part of the fabric of Montana at the time. And people were pretty powerless against the powerful. The best example of that was over in Butte when they had a thing called the Apex Law. The Copper Kings, that's a plural, kings, because they fought each other for control of the copper. And the third Copper King was Augusta. It's W.A. Clark and Marcus Daly and and Heinze, Augustus Heinze. And Heinze, remember that Clark had wanted to be a politician. He wanted to get the honor of being an office holder. So he bribed his way into the U.S. Senate. Literally, they took paper bags of cash and put them over the transom of the rooms of all the legislators. He was staying at the Placer Hotel or whatever hotel they were staying in, and sent them a little missive that said, vote for Clark. In those days, the senators were elected by the legislature. Vote for Clark, and he bribed his way, to the Senate, and they always referred to him as the only senator who was later expelled for that type of thing. It's a little bit of a misrepresentation, but nonetheless, he did. So he had that. Well, Heinze, and he was bribing all these 100 plus legislators. Heinze was more efficient. He figured out that he just only had to bribe 2 judges in Butte, because what he would do is take the laws of mining and take it to his advantage. And then he had 2 judges that would always automatically give him his. In fact, they all would always say that one of the judges he'd wake up and he would rule for Heinze, But one of those was a thing called the Apex Law. The Apex Law said if you had a vein that was coming out and it protruded out of the ground, the surface of the ground, and you had the mining claim where the protrusion took place, that the owner of that claim could follow the vein underground as far as he wanted to. And so they were having underground battles over who owned the copper under there, and some of the times the people were fighting over it. Well, Heinze he would always get the decision he wanted because he controlled the 2 judges in Butte. And so the Anaconda Company by that time said, Amalgamated it was called, we need to have a change of venue. We need to be able to give a new judge. And with the new judge, maybe we'll get a fair shake. And the Heinze said no, and they went to the governor, they went to the governor and said, would you call a special session to change this law so we can have honest judges take care of this business, or at least maybe even favorable judges? And he said no, and they said, no, you got to call a special session to do this. He said, no, I don't do that. They said, if you don't call a special session, we're going to shut down all of our operations in Montana. And he thought they were bluffing, so he said, no, I'm not calling a special session for you. So the Anaconda Company in 1903 shut down everything they had in the state of Montana. 3/4 of the paychecks went away. 3 weeks later, magically, the governor just thought, well, maybe I gotta call a special session. And they passed the law that the Anaconda Company wanted. And what that was symbolic of was what became known as the copper collar. The strength of the Anaconda Company predominantly and all of its economic allies dominating the state. And that then essentially stayed in place up to and into the 60s. Think about that, all that time, that powerful interest of the Anaconda Company. They even had martial law declared in Butte, and soldiers on the streets of Butte with Gatling guns and everything lined up there to make sure that the workers went into the mines and got the copper out, purportedly for the World War I effort, because they had problems with unions over there. But funny how it stayed for 7 years, So I don't know, you're a little reflection on the...
One of the other major things, too, about the Anaconda Company, and Chuck, you know more about this than I do, is that they owned most of the newspapers in the state up until 1959.
That's correct, and it was called the Copper Press, and initially they were quite active in making sure they got the candidates they wanted elected through news coverage and editorials, but starting in like the 30s and 40s, they just kind of ignored things. They just made sure no one else could have a role there. They had basically all the daily papers, except for the Great Falls Tribune, were under their control, and the papers were notoriously bad. A number of national magazines did stories about how bad they were in Montana, and there wasn't very aggressive reporting.
Well, you know what? The historical journals, the books kind of indicate that it wasn't that they put lies in the press. It's that if they didn't want you to know something, you didn't know it. It was more of an omission and keeping news away from people, which is why we had the case where I think it was I'm looking at for that quote.
The Economist, I think it was.
Yeah, The Economist The Economist said, Montana newspaper readers are, quote, worse informed about their own affairs than the inhabitants of almost any other state. And that was a statement made in 1957. That's 68 years after our Constitution was passed. At that point, the Anaconda Company still owned the press.
So no stories about industrial accidents in the mines where workers were killed. You know, no stories about lawsuits against the companies.
Silicosis.
Yeah, all just verboten. You know, they might cover the high school football game, they might cover Mother's Day, but no meaningful looks at the tax system in Montana or the appropriation system. It was just really weak journalism, and Montana suffered for it for decades.
Yeah, they no question about that. That they when we talk about silicosis, which is black lung in terms of miners, but when you're a hard rock miner, it's the dust of the silicon dust from the hard rock goes into the lungs, and then they end up having consumption, and then they die from that. And they not only didn't want that stuff reported, but do you know that when it came time for the state of Montana, like under workers' compensation, covers industrial accidents, but amazingly, silicosis was not covered. Silicosis was paid for by the taxpayer, not by the company, or even the company's insurance company, by the taxpayers, so that there were county taxes and there were little state appropriations, and they made sure the state appropriations were small and forced the counties then to pay taxes too. And that was all, but the whole point was that was all public money, citizens' money, and the companies didn't have to pay it. That's another example of the strength of the Anaconda Company and the copper collar. You know that we'll mention that about what happened in 1959, but in John Gunther in 1947. Again, now this is 58 years after our Constitution. Just after World War II, John Gunther was one of the top authors in the nation. He wrote a series of books, Inside USA, and he'd write about different states. And he wrote, Anaconda, a company aptly named, has a constrictor-like grip on much that goes on, and Montana is the nearest thing to a colony of any American state. So it just wasn't happening. It was happening inside our borders, but everybody was observing what a mess it was here in Montana. And Ted Schwinden went a long ways toward. I told him, I said, "Would you tell me what went into this? How did this happen? What happened in this period to make it happen?" And in a session I did with him, he went through that. And he mentioned things like the press change. So what was the impact of the change in the press when they did get bought by Lee Papers?
Well, they started hiring some really good young investigative reporters like Jerry Holleran, Dan Foley, Art Hutchinson, John Coughlan and the Tribune beefed up its coverage too. John Coughlan, Jerry Madden, Frank Adams. So for the first time, really, you had aggressive State House coverage exposing some of the things that weren't working in state government. You also had legislative audits. The legislature approved a legislative audit division. So they would check and make sure the state agencies spent the money as intended. And if the money wasn't going to that way, they would point it out. And
of course, the press then, you had press that would report it.
Yeah, it was covered. And the Legislative Audit Division did one of its first audits was about how the state investments were all invested separately by, you know, this Department of State Lands or the Department of Revenue or whatever it was, and they went into banks and that paid no interest on the state money. They were doing the state a favor by keeping the state money interest-free.
We'll take care of your money for you, yeah.
And Forrest Anderson, in his executive reorganization bill in 1971, slipped in the Unified Investments, which created the State Board of Investments, which now I think it's $20-30 billion, and it's invested in a unified way by the Board of Investments and a professional investment manager. In the past, that would have just gone to local banks to have just the luxury of having that money at no cost to them.
Well, clearly, an Anaconda Company-owned newspaper would not have been reporting that. So with the, you know, now that we've had the Lee newspapers here since 1959, people want to complain about this or that about the Lee papers. But if you go back to when it happened, they were part of the saving of Montana by bringing information to citizens for the first time ever. These young reporters, Ted Schwinden, former Governor Schwinden, said, "Boy, that was an amazing thing. They went in and they dug around and they found stuff, and it was pretty darn amazing what happened that way." You know, one of the other things that Ted mentioned that helped contribute to the context that we're talking about is having a bit of enlightenment in the people, because people who've been kept into the dark don't often know they're in the dark. But when World War II came, and he was one of the last people that were conscripted for World War II. So he was a World War II veteran right at the tail end. But he said, you know, all of the Montana farm kids, he likened it to farm kids because Ted was from Tule Creek out there in Roosevelt County. And he said all of the farm kids, but it applied to the city kids as well, went off to what would be thought of as exotic places, although they went there under war conditions. And they came back having seen war, which affects their character and their maturity, and having seen a bit of the world, if you will, and suddenly they were back in Montana, and then this little thing happened called the GI Bill. And God bless education, right? Suddenly all these returning veterans, not every one of them, but huge numbers, by the tens of thousands, are going to college and getting degrees and getting advanced degrees and entering the professional workforce, and their eyes were opened differently by both education and the war experience. And it was from that you had a frustration start to occur, because people were saying, it shouldn't have to be this way. And when you combine that with the newspapers.
It was Tom Brokaw's greatest generation. They came back to their towns and organized to build a new hospital in the town, or a new high school, or you know, put more money into the university in their town or the college, and YMCAs and YWCAs. They came back with the idea they were going to improve things, and they did.
Yeah. And but there was that awareness about state government, because the press first. Now, when he started have the lead newspapers do the coverage, and then the journalism that happened with the Tribune as well. Prior to that, if you wanted to know what was going on, you had to have these hidden little journals. You know, in our family, the People's Voice, run by Harry and Gretchen Billings, were just a couple progressive types, and they decided they were going to tell the truth about Montana state government. They put out, every week they put out a paper. And you know what the subscription for a year was to it? They lived on subscriptions, $5 a year. And it was a physical paper that got mailed to you. Wow. And I remember that was a paper that, along with the Carbon County News at our house, there was the People's Voice over here. And we could look at that, and suddenly they'd be telling the story about what was going on in the legislature. The only problem being, of course, their circulation was nothing, right? So, you know, it does speak, by the way, to the value of a free press.
Absolutely. Yep.
Which is built into our Constitution and our U.S. Constitution. And, you know, we want to get mad at the media now and then, but without that, that's what dictatorship is about. Authoritarian government is one of the first things they do is take over or get rid of the press.
We had a legislature in those days, Evan, that met for 60 days, calendar days, every 2 years. So if they took a Sunday off, that counted against the 60.
So by the end of February, they had to be done.
And if they didn't finish, they would cover the clock, stop the clock, and cover it with a towel or butcher paper, and keep meeting until they were done. The committees were, like Nancy said, were not well noticed. You didn't know when a bill you were interested in was going to be heard. The main debates would take place on the House and Senate floors, and they're called second reading debates. They followed the debate on the bill. The votes those were not recorded votes. So they'd had these voting boards. They'd press red or green how they're voting, and it would tabulate the votes, and then it was taken down.
So they were up there on the wall just momentarily, and then poof, they're gone.
And lobbyists would keep track. You'd watch the first 10 names, I'd watch the next, and Nancy. So they knew who was voting.
The powerful who had lobbyists knew what was going on, but the rest of us wouldn't know anything.
And so it was a legislature that met quickly. We had a case where we didn't have a legislative council then, no research, independent research. So if you got elected to the legislature from Glasgow or Dillon or someplace and had some bills, you had to get them drafted yourself. Hire a lawyer to draft them or find a friend that would draft them. Or you could get the Anaconda Company or Montana Power's legal department, which were combined in those days, to draft one for you, but never draft a bill to tighten regulation of the Montana Power Company or to raise the tax on copper mining. So it was very limited in what bills were heard, and these legislators were very poorly paid and very little money per diem. So where did they go for dinner? A lot of them went up to what were called watering holes, the 6th floor of the Placer Hotel, where the Anaconda Company and the Montana Power had what they called a hospitality room, or known to others as watering holes. And they would feed and feed them drinks and a nice meal and become good friends with them.
Well, that's the way of K Street, as they would say. But it was notorious up there on the 6th floor. And every night was a birthday party for somebody. There were enough people around, enough legislators around, enough lobbyists around it. Hey, this is a birthday for so-and-so. Come on up there. And they go up there and they got free liquor and free dinner. And, we will draft your bill for you if you want. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Think about that. That bill drafting was another interesting thing. I think there was no internet for research. That's why having their lawyers do stuff for you. How else did you get it done? If you look at the bills themselves, there was no internet to look for a bill. They had to be printed just like this. So if you wanted to get a copy of a bill, you had to go down into the basement where they had a room with racks and racks and racks and these manila folders, and each one had bills in it. And if you wanted to read what a bill was about, you'd have to say, would you give me House Bill 120? And they'd say, we're out of them, but if you come back, we'll have some more printed up tomorrow. And then if you got it, you got House Bill 120, and they handed it to you, but you had to hand them a quarter. Now that was part of the product of the lack of technology but nonetheless, it enhanced the secretiveness of everything. And
it's as though they didn't want the public around.
No, they didn't.
They didn't want to hear from them in committees. They didn't want them to see how their legislators voted. They didn't want them to read the bills.
Yeah.
The secretiveness of the bills themselves and having them around, it was very interesting. When they formed a legislative council, which was a very important modernization and strengthening of the legislature, was between sessions. I mean, they had some of them appointed to a council that would do research and study on their own. They started into that, and the first director of the research council who by the way later became an attorney for the Anaconda Company, was a fellow named Gene Tidball. And by the way, it was a forgivable thing in a sense. Gene's wife had a terrible medical problem, and he had very big difficulty getting her medical stuff covered, and working for the Anaconda Company became one of the only things he could probably do that got her medical stuff paid. And so I often, while I'm critical of things, you have to understand the human side of things. But Gene was a bright young attorney that headed up the Legislative Council, and when they first put bills together, they created 5 copies of the bill, of the original bill, and one would go to the House, and one would go to the Senate, and one would go to the chairman of the committee that was going to go to, and one was for some other reason. But they had a 5th one, and they didn't. He was asking the staff, well, where does this last bill go? And all of them said, well, I don't know, you know. So they did a big project. They engaged in deep, dark research to drive, where did this bill come? And they really did dig hard to find out, where did the bills go? And you know where the 5th bill went? To the Anaconda Company. Yeah. So that's how much sway they had. You know, we talk about taxes. I want to mention this at the university system. A professor of economics at the University of Montana named Louis Levine decided to do a research paper, and it ended up in the form of a book about who paid taxes in Montana, which pointed out that major agricultural interests and mining interests did not pay taxes to any degree in Montana. And he published it as a book and then got fired from the university. And it was like a big cause celeb, you know, oh my God. And there was a fuss made about it because it was so egregious. And so the university thought it was better, and the Anaconda Company thought it was better, and they let him go back to work. But within 3 months, he had moved to Michigan and never came back to Montana. But so when we talk about one of the things in the new Constitution, which is the independence of the university system from the political control of the legislature, and people wonder why. Well, there's a little bit of history about why that stuff's important. You know, it's kind of interesting. So the League of Women Voters started doing research.
Yes.
Because everyone could see there were problems here.
There were problems with, I think, a couple different areas there were problems. One was the secretiveness that we've talked about already, but another is that a lot of things were happening in the state, and the old Constitution was incapable of giving the state what it needed to be able to deal with what was happening. I think one of the biggest issues coming up was the whole environmental question. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the things that needed to get done, you just simply couldn't do under the old Constitution. Mm-hmm. So there was a lot of different reasons that came together. But yeah, the League did a couple of studies in the late '68 and '69 and researched what a Constitution should be doing, and were prepared then to get behind this whole notion to have the legislature pass a legislative referendum to go out to the voters to actually have a constitutional convention.
Yeah, that was a part of a big push. You know, the intellectual framework of support for this thing came from the women of Montana, yeah, who had been kept silent in 1889.
Yes.
They never had a voice in the Constitution, and they wanted a new Constitution that they might have a voice in. You know, yeah. Now they ended up the League, when you were first working in '71. The League of Women Voters was active as a lobbying group, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. And the call for the convention had been approved by voters, I think 65% of the voters in the November 1970 election. But the League had its lobbyists up there to help.
Well, they were there in the '69 session, right, pushing all that. Yeah.
And they wanted to make sure enough money got appropriated for a good convention and the various requirements to call one. And one interesting thing, the first session I was up there was '71. There were exactly 2 women in the, I think, 154 person bodies.
Toni Roselle and Dorothy Bradley.
Dorothy Bradley was a freshman. 2 women.
2 women out of 100, and that in those days it was 154 legislators. Right. 2 out of 154.
Yeah. But the League had some really intelligent, hardworking, and sharp and persistent lobbyists, and the ones I remember were Daphne Bugby, later Daphne Bugby Jones, Dorothy Eck from Bozeman. Daphne was from Missoula. And the third one, I think, was Carol Anderson of Billings. And they were tireless and relentless at their lobbying, and they were respected by people because they worked so hard up there.
And so they had a nickname for them, didn't they?
They did.
the men of the legislature.
The men of the legislature had a nickname for them because they were unaccustomed to having people be that persistent, citizens be there and be watching what was going on. And so their nickname among certain circles, probably on the 6th floor of the Plaza Hotel, was the plague of women vultures, because they were so persistent. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, God bless the women of Montana. And by the way, when they did have the election and women could run, unlike 1889 and 1884, even though it sounds modest right now, we went from two women legislators out of 154 to 19 out of 100.
Yeah, of the delegates to the CONCON, yeah.
Now, who were those people? Because they really made a big difference.
They did.
And they were among the more powerful voices in the Constitutional Convention.
Well, I think it's important to notice that the convention had its leadership, and it had I think it was called the president of the convention, or what was his title? But anyway,
the president.
President.
Leo Graybill, yeah.
And then we had a secretary and a treasurer and a western and an eastern vice president. So 5 people together. 2 of them were women.
Yeah,
Both of them were League members.
Right.
And the League is a nonpartisan organization. One of them was Dorothy Eck, who was a Democrat from Bozeman, and the other was Jean Bowman, who was a Republican from Billings.
Yeah.
So they were right there as part of the leadership team for the convention, right at the very top. But we also have, among the 19 other women who were delegates, was Louise Cross from Eastern Montana, Glendive,
yeah.
who'd been extremely active in the AAUW, doing studies of coal strip
Another
mining.
group that was really a women's group that was very instrumental along with the League.
Very instrumental. And then we also had, I think, to me, one of the more amazing stories about how this all came to be is the role that Lucille Spear played. She was a League member from Missoula. She and Marge Brown put together a publication called We the People, and it was an introduction to the Montana Constitutional Convention. And that document was published by the Extension Service and distributed widely throughout the state, including to all of the delegates who were going to be assembling to actually write the Constitution. And if you stop and think about it, the very first introduction you have to something has an incredible influence on what you see you're supposed to be doing in terms of the delegates themselves getting a good comprehensive sense of what they were supposed to do, but also in terms of everyone else in the state understanding what this was all about. And this was the document that went out to people and gave them their initial comprehensive idea. Oh, okay, what is it? What are we doing here? Oh, this is what we're doing. And that was written by the League.
And there was great interest in the Constitutional Convention, and 515 Montanans
filed for that.
Filed for the 100 seats, and there was a primary, but a key to the whole thing was the Montana Supreme Court in '71 had ruled that existing legislators, existing county commissioners, city council members could not run for the convention because they would be holding 2 elected offices simultaneously.
Which was prohibited, yeah.
That opened the gateway up to people that probably wouldn't have run otherwise.
Well, if your Constitution was written by legislators that already were comfortable with the power structure pretty much, we wouldn't have had the same Constitution we had. It was a citizen-based Constitution because of that. It was a pretty remarkable set of circumstances there. I would say, by the way, good thinking to use the Extension Service, because the Extension Service, one, goes to all 56 counties. It's also in a way a rural communication vehicle, and so reaching rural Montana, not just the urban centers, was important. It's attached to Montana State University, which is as we used to call it back then, the Cow College, and so having the Extension Service produce these documents that went out across the state, including all of rural Montana, was very important. Now, one of the things that led to the movement for change that was happening in Montana at this time was reapportionment. And I wonder if you might comment on that a little bit, Chuck.
There were two decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court in the 60s that dealt with one person, one vote. The one most relevant to Montana was Reynolds v. Sims, which I think was in 1965. And it held that state legislative bodies had to be apportioned related to the population, not each county gets one senator like many states had. So in Montana, we had before that Petroleum County with 800 people.
Yeah, because we modeled after the federal, so every county, which were arbitrarily drawn areas, but each one qualified like a state to have one senator.
The House seats were based on population.
Right.
So you had Petroleum or Treasure County with 700 or 800 people with one senator. Yellowstone County, then and now the most populous, I think had 80,000 people, one senator. So you had a very conservative Senate run by rural legislators that a lot of them didn't want to see much change. So this decision came down, and Governor Babcock, Tim Babcock, said, well, that'll never work in Montana. We're not going to do it here. The next day, a woman from Butte named Phoebe Herwig filed a lawsuit in federal court and prevailed, and the legislature was ordered to reapportion and make the Senate representative of the people.
And when they did a lousy job of it, and the court redid it. And they did it for them. It was kind of interesting that they would do that. But those, by the way, Petroleum County and Yellowstone County touch each other. So you had the 100-to-1 differential depending on which side of the county line you happen to, in terms of the power that you had. And at the time, the analysis showed that in the Montana Senate, 19% of the senators could control all the votes. 19% of the senators who represented 19% of the population could control the decision making. And on the House, it was a little easier, but it was by population. But it also said there was a minimum of one per county. So because of that, it was still disproportionate a little bit. In that case, it said on the House side, 37%. Representatives represented 37% of the population could control the decision, and in the Senate it was 19%. So when you came to the CONCON itself, it applied, the population rule was applied to that, and of course it's been applied to our legislators since then. We no longer follow the federal model, but that's because of Reynolds versus Sims, right?
Right.
Yeah, that made a big difference. Now you mentioned the vote. It was very interesting. People seem to have been in this, and there was enough interest in change across the state, and it wasn't Democrats or Republicans. It's kind of most everybody was interested in seeing some change. 65% voted in 1970 for it. They put that to the ballot in 69. They said, we'll vote in 70. In the meantime, they also formed a reform commission. And the reform commission started preparing the research for the convention in anticipation that they might get a positive vote. They got a little federal money and some state money and mixed them up together. And that commission hired Dale Harris to run it all, and they started hiring research staff, really talented young research people who were, and in those days doing research was, you'd call up some other state and say, can you somehow make a copy of that document and mail it back across the country to us? There wasn't even fax machines. And so getting documentation was really a difficult thing to do. So that they did 2 years of the research up front. By the way, one of the last remaining living member of that Reform Commission is former State Senator Harry Mitchell of Great Falls. And he was in one of our episodes. And we're pleased to be able to still, because last year we lost two of the others. Two of those that remained were Jim Murray and Wade DeHood. And we lost them both in the last 2 years. So we're pleased to be able to have Harry speak to it, the issues here as well. But that Reform Commission, and then the election took place and said 65% we need to have a convention. And then they had to hold elections and of those 100 people. And when they were elected, 19 were women. I mean, what a marvelous change from the silence of women in 1889.
And I think, at least as of about 2013 or 14, that percentage of almost 20% women is the largest percentage of women in a constitutional convention anywhere in this country.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody's done any since then, so it probably still stands.
Well, when you look at the list of the people that were on those 19, they were real powerful forces.
They were.
And both parties.
Yes.
And you know, the Betty Babcock, you know, the governor didn't like reapportionment. The governor didn't even like the Constitution, but Betty got in the Constitutional Convention and became a real workhorse in getting it passed. So there were a lot of interesting things that happened there. Yeah. Now, just to mention a little bit of history, the powerful interests kind of looked aside and said, well, you know, these people want to hold a convention. Let's let them hold a convention, you know, because this stuff will never pass. And then they suddenly, what happened to them is their lobbying capability.
The delegates had a different view of what should happen than the legislatures had. And they said no lobbyists will ever be on the floor of the House where they met. And they required the lobbyists and the groups they represented to file, I think, monthly reports showing how much they'd spent to try to influence the delegates. The legislature didn't do that until 1981, and that followed a citizen initiative led by Paul Richards to require the legislature to do it.
So you really had a situation where the lobbyists, all of a sudden, were constrained a bit. You got to register, and you tell us how much you're spending, and stay off the floor, and the whole world changed for those folks right then and there. But it took the legislature on its own to change that, people to change it totally 10 more years.
And I think a lot of the delegates didn't feel comfortable going to the lobbyist parties at night. They actually did some other interesting things at night. They brought in speakers. Jeanette Rankin came in. She was the first one, and then they got Charles Lindbergh to come in. His son Land lived over in near Missoula,
Potomac. Yep.
Potomac. They had
Gardner, what was his name?
John Gardner,
Gardner.
the founder of Common Cause, former
Yes.
Right.
Health, Education, and Welfare Secretary under Lyndon Johnson. They got maybe a half a dozen or so speakers that would come in. Someone knew someone, and they'd invite them, and they were happy to come.
Yeah.
You know, it was a pretty revolutionary thing, and the change was needed. The research done by and again, this was so bipartisan, and by the way, before the convention even started happening, when in their organizational sessions, they sat alphabetically instead of by party, and they shared the leadership, and so because of that, you had a document that was truly. They worked together as citizens. And I've had so many of the Constitutional Convention delegates say, and I'm kind of inclined to go that way, that we might all be well served if our really highly partisan and hyper-partisan legislature and Congress, if they sat alphabetically and got to know each other and work together, they might have might produce a better product for the citizens of Montana, you know.
I suggested that in a couple of newspaper columns over the years. It died. It didn't pick up anyone proposing it.
I've been writing that in a few of my columns. Well, we're approaching the end here now, and this has been a wonderful hour full of great information from you guys. I really, really do appreciate you being here. This is a marvelous story of the power moving from the powerful vested interest to the people, and it's worth noting that. That's why it is the last best Constitution. For all of you who have joined us today, we appreciate you joining us. We hope you'll come back and watch future episodes of Last Best Constitution. Thank you.